Hi everyone, and welcome back to week 4 of Reproduction and the Law. Last week we spent some time talking about what do we do when reproductive rights and advances in technology collide. For example, is the viability standard enunciated in Planned Parenthood versus Casey still workable when we know that the date of viability is being pushed earlier and earlier? We also talked about some of the inherent contradictions in our current legal code. We know that in Roe versus Wade, the court very emphatically said a fetus is not a person under the 14th Amendment, yet we now have the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, which says that if you harm a pregnant woman and the fetus is killed, no matter what stage of gestation, you can be charged with the homicide of that fetus. So how can a fetus be a person in one circumstance, but not a person in the circumstance of abortion? How do we deal with those inherent contradictions? This week we jump into another thorny area, like they've all been, right? What do we do when religious rights and reproductive rights collide? And this often comes up with questions of where does one person's right begin and another one's right end? A perfect example is the issue of pharmacist refusals. I'm sure you've all seen in the news that there are some pharmacists who are refusing to dispense contraception or emergency contraception because doing so would violate his or her religious beliefs. The question is, do they have a right to do that? Imagine the scenario playing out like this. A woman has sex on a Thursday night at 9 o'clock at night. Condom breaks, so she's effectively had unprotected sex. She wants to get emergency contraception, also known as Plan B, to prevent an unintended pregnancy. We know that Plan B is more effective the sooner that's taken. So there's a time limit imposed on when you need to get emergency contraception, because after a certain point, the effectiveness goes down rapidly. So she goes to a pharmacy and walks up to the pharmacist and says, I'd like to get emergency contraception. And the pharmacist says, I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't stock emergency contraception. It goes against our religious beliefs. Or the pharmacist says, well, we stock it, but it goes against my religious beliefs, so I'm not going to dispense it to you. That woman now needs to go to another pharmacy in order to try to obtain emergency contraception. What happens if she's in a small town? What happens if there's really only one pharmacy in the entire town? Does she have to drive to another town? Is she potentially going to end up outside of the window of effectiveness for Plan B? So whose rights trump who's there? Does the woman have the better argument that she should be able to access lawful reproductive health care? Or does the pharmacist have a better argument that his religious rights should not be trumped by a woman trying to get something that he deems immoral? Who has the better argument? I've posted some news articles and some issue briefs on this issue. I'd like you to read through them and think, who has the better side of the argument here? How do we draw a line between religious rights and reproductive rights? And where do we draw that line? I've also posted Senate Bill 809, which was a legislative attempt to deal with this issue. It has not become law. It was a bill that did not end up being enacted. Think about whether this bill strikes the appropriate balance. What could it possibly do to small businesses, for example? Are we losing sight of the rights of business owners? Does it actually protect women who are seeking to get things like emergency contraception? Does it adequately protect the religious rights of pharmacies and pharmacists? Does the bill strike the right balance? So read through the issue briefs, look at the bill, and figure out whether that bill is sort of achieving the balance we want to achieve between the two competing rights. Another issue that can come up with pharmacist refusals is employment. We know that there are protections in state and federal law that prohibit discrimination in employment based on religion. What if you are a pharmacy looking to hire a pharmacist, and the most qualified person for the job says to you, I'll do everything you ask me to do. I graduated from the top school, I have a great reputation, I have great references, but I won't dispense emergency contraception. You, the business owner, then don't hire that person. Have you engaged in employment discrimination? Have you potentially run afoul of, for example, Title VII because you're discriminating on the basis of religious beliefs? Or are you just making a smart business decision? How do we figure that out? So this issue of pharmacist refusals can put women in a tight spot can put employers in a tight spot, and obviously puts the person who is making the refusal in a very tight spot if they can't get a job because of their religious beliefs. Okay, so think through these issues. A second area where religion and reproductive rights are colliding is one that's been in the news very, very recently. There are several portions of current federal law that provide what are called conscience clause protections. There's something called the Weldon Amendment and something called the Church Amendment. These basically say that if you are an entity receiving federal funds, you cannot discriminate against an employee who refuses to provide abortion or sterilization services because doing so would conflict with your religious or moral beliefs. So discriminating against an employee obviously means something like firing that employee because the employee refuses to perform an abortion. So this has been federal law for a long time. The new issue is this. On December 18th, 2008, President Bush, as one of his last acts, asked the Department of Health and Human Services to issue a new rule interpreting the current federal protections. And that new rule effectively takes the force of law. The rule that was promulgated by the Department of Health and Human Services is arguably significantly broader than the protections were prior to the enactment of this new rule. Okay? Groups opposed to the rule have said, for example, it's so broad that it could allow individuals and entities to refuse to provide information about abortion. It could allow individuals and entities to refuse to provide contraception or refuse to provide emergency services, for example. There is currently another protection in federal law called EMTALA. And what EMTALA does, and I should back up, EMTALA is the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. And what EMTALA says, and has said for years, is that if you are a facility with an emergency room, you have to provide emergency care to someone coming into your facility, even if that means emergency abortion care. Okay? This is only for the most extreme circumstances. If a woman comes in order to save her life, she needs to have an abortion. Federal law requires that that be done to save her life. Critics of the new Bush rule have said, wait a minute, does this new rule effectively trump EMTALA? Would a woman now not be able to get an abortion even in emergency circumstances? So there have been a lot of critiques raised about the new rule. Obama has said that he is looking to actually rescind the rule, and a lot of groups are lobbying heavily for that to be done. But my question for you is this. Is this really true? Okay. Is the sky actually falling? Does the new Bush rule actually have these effects? Or does it simply codify and clarify existing federal law like the Church Amendment and the Weldon Amendment? I want you to spend some time reading through the text of the rule, and I've indicated on Blackboard how to go about finding that. And then spend some time Googling. See what various groups are saying about it and see who has the better argument. There's a tendency, as with lots of reproductive rights issues, for groups on both sides of the aisle to take extreme positions. And I want you to try to figure out, does one of them have it right, or is there some sort of middle ground? So read through the actual rule, try to decipher it, figure out what it does, how it would actually change or not change federal law. Figure out what various groups are saying about it, and then figure out where you come out on it. So this week, religion, reproductive rights, where does one end, where does the other begin? And I'll see you on Blackboard.